Edward Settle Godfrey Jr., a seasoned cavalryman and one of the few surviving officers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, witnessed the Battle of Little Bighorn with his own eyes. His harrowing account of that fateful day has become a crucial piece of the historical puzzle, shedding light on the triumphs and tragedies of Custer's last stand. In our previous episodes, we've explored Godfrey's eyewitness testimony, and now, in this final episode, we'll continue his gripping story, uncovering new details and insights into the battle's most pivotal moments, as seen through the eyes of a man who lived it. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. Benteen's battalion was ordered to divide its ammunition with Reno's men, who had apparently expended nearly all in their possession. Lieutenant Hare was ordered to retrieve the ammunition pack-mules. Fortunately, the Indians had not discovered and waylaid the pack train. While waiting for the ammunition pack-mules, Major Reno decided to attempt to recover and bury Lieutenant Hodgson's body. Reno requested a carbine, stating he had lost his pistols in the charge. A few men were loaded with canteens to fetch water for the command, accompanying the rescuing party. The effort proved futile, as the party was fired upon by Indians, likely scalping the dead near the foot of the bluffs. A gathering of officers congregated on the edge of the bluff overlooking the valley, engaged in discussing the situation. Among our number was Captain Moylan, a seasoned soldier of great merit, who observed the scene below. Moylan remarked with emphasis, "Gentlemen, in my opinion, General Custer has made the most egregious mistake of his life by not leading the entire regiment in the initial attack." At this time, a large number of horsemen, Indians, occupied the valley. Suddenly, they all departed down the valley, and within minutes, scarcely a horseman remained in sight. Heavy firing was heard down the river. During this interval, questions were posed. What's amiss with Custer, that he doesn't dispatch word regarding our course of action? Why do we tarry here? And so forth, betraying a sense of unease. Yet no one appeared to exhibit great anxiety or serious apprehension that Custer could not or would not take care of himself. Some of Reno's men had espied Custer's headquarters party, including Custer himself, on the bluffs around the time the Indians began to assemble in Reno's front. This party was heard to cheer and seen to wave their hats as if to offer encouragement, then disappeared behind the hills or escaped further attention from those below. Major Moylan believes that the last he saw of Custer's party was near the position of Reno Hill. Major DeRudio thinks he saw Custer on the ridge opposite where Dr. DeWolf was killed. He recounts that Custer and Tom were dismounted, seemingly observing them through field glasses. Reno was then forming into a line of skirmishers. He saw them mount and vanish. Custer's battalion was not seen by Reno's troops after their separation. It was around the time Custer was last seen that Trumpeter Martin departed from Cook with Custer's final orders to Benteen. "Benteen, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. Cook. Adjutant. P.S. Bring packs." The repetition in the order suggests that Cook was excited, flustered, or sought to emphasize the necessity of escorting the packs. It is possible that from a high vantage point, Custer had beheld nearly the entirety of the Indian camp in force, realizing that the prospects were desperate, but too late to reunite his forces for the attack. Reno was already engaged in the fight, and his own battalion was separated from the attack by a distance of 2.5 to 3 miles. He had no reason to assume that Reno would not press his attack with vigor. A commander seldom enters battle anticipating the failure of his lieutenant. If he did, he would provide for such a failure not to devolve into disaster. For an extended period following the junction of Reno and Benteen's forces, we heard firing down the river in the direction of Custer's command. We were convinced that Custer was engaged with the Indians somewhere, and the sentiment was expressed that our command ought to be taking action, or Custer would be after Reno with a sharp stick. We heard 2 distinct volleys, which excited some surprise, and, if I am not mistaken, elicited the remark from someone that Custer is giving it to them with all his might. I now have little doubt that these volleys were fired by Custer's orders as signals of distress and to indicate his location. Captain Weir and Lieutenant Edgerly, after repelling the Indians from Reno's command, grew impatient at the delay and thought they would move in the direction of the firing, if permitted. Weir began to seek permission but changed his mind, deciding to survey the situation from the high bluffs first. Edgerly, seeing we're heading toward the firing, assumed it was acceptable and started down the ravine with the troop. Captain Weir, from the high point, saw the Indians in large numbers moving toward Edgerly and signaled for him to alter his course. Edgerly joined Weir at the high point, where they remained, not seriously molested, until the remainder of the troops marched down. The Indians were observed by them to ride about what later proved to be Custer's battlefield, shooting into the bodies of the dead men or killing wounded men. McDougal arrived with the pack train and reported the firing when he announced his arrival to Reno. I distinctly recall glancing at my watch at 20 minutes past 4 and making a note of it in my memorandum book. Although I have never satisfactorily recalled what specific incident occurred at that time, it was an important event before we commenced our march down the river. In my estimation, however, it was the arrival of the pack train. Around this time, 13 men and a scout named Hare rejoined the command. They had been missing since Reno's flight from the bottom. Several of them were wounded. These men had lost their horses in the stampede from the bottom and had remained in the timber. When leaving the timber to rejoin, they were fired upon by 5 Indians but drove them away. My recollection is that it was approximately 2:30 when we joined Reno's forces. Around 5 o'clock, the command proceeded down toward Custer's supposed location, intending to join him. The advance continued as far as the high bluffs, where the command was halted. Those familiar with the plains and having witnessed stationary objects appearing to dance before them, now in view and now obscured, or a weed on the top of a hill, magnified against the sky to appear as a tree, will readily comprehend why our views were unsatisfactory. The air was thick with dust. We beheld stationary groups of horsemen and individual horsemen moving about. From their grouping and the manner in which they sat their horses, we knew they were Indians. On the left of the valley, a peculiar sight caught our attention. Someone remarked that a fire had scorched the leaves of the bushes, causing the reddish-brown appearance, but this appearance shifted. Watching this intently for a short time with field glasses, it was discovered that this strange sight was, in fact, the immense Indian pony herds. Looking toward Custer's field, on a hill 2 miles distant, we saw a large assemblage. Initially, our command did not seem to attract their attention, although some commotion was observable among those near our position. We heard occasional shots, most of which appeared to be at a great distance, beyond the large groups on the hill. While observing this group, the conclusion was reached that Custer had been repulsed, and the firing we heard was the parting shots of the rear guard. The firing ceased, the groups dispersed, clouds of dust arose from all parts of the field, and the horsemen converged toward our position. The command was now dismounted to fight on foot. Captain Weir's and French's troops were posted on the high bluffs and to the front of them. My own troop along the crest of the bluffs adjacent to the river, while the rest of the command moved to the rear, ostensibly to occupy other points in the vicinity, thereby establishing our defensive position. Engrossed in posting my men and providing directions regarding ammunition usage, I was somewhat startled by the remark that the command was no longer in sight. At this juncture, Weir's and French's troops were under attack. Orders were soon conveyed to me by Lieutenant Hare, acting adjutant, to rejoin the main command. I had proceeded some distance in executing this order when, glancing back, I beheld French's troop hastening over the bluffs, followed shortly by Weir's troop in similar haste. Edgerly was near the top of the bluff, endeavoring to mount his frantic horse, and it seemed uncertain whether he would succeed, but he vaulted into his saddle and joined the troop. The Indians promptly followed to the top of the bluff, commencing fire into the retreating troops, killing 1 man, wounding others, and several horses. They then pursued down the hillside. I immediately resolved that such a retreat and close pursuit would precipitate the entire command into confusion, potentially proving disastrous. I dismounted my men to fight on foot, deploying as rapidly as possible without adhering to the tactical formation. Lieutenant Hare expressed his intention to remain with me, adjutant or no adjutant. The led horses were dispatched to the main command. Our fire soon compelled the Indians to halt and take cover, but before this was achieved, a second order arrived for me to fall back to the main command with all due haste. Having checked the pursuit, we began our retreat, initially slowly, while maintaining our firing. After proceeding some distance, the men began to congregate and move faster, with our fire slackening. This indicated demoralization. The Indians, reinforced, emerged from their cover, maintaining heavy fire. I halted the line, re-established intervals, and again drove the Indians to cover, then resumed our retreat. The Indian firing was not intense, but the ping-ping of bullets overhead seemed more terrifying than the swish-thud of those striking the ground nearby. Upon reaching the ridge before Reno's position, I observed Indians hastening to secure a hill to the right, which would command Reno's position. Supposing my troop was to occupy our current line, I ordered Hare to take 10 men and hold the hill, but an order from Reno arrived, directing us to return quickly, so I recalled Hare, drove the Indians to cover once more, and ordered the men to run to the lines. This movement was executed, surprisingly, without a single casualty. The Indians now seized control of all surrounding high points, unleashing a heavy fire. Meanwhile, they had dispatched a substantial force up the valley, encircling our position. It was now approximately 7 o'clock. Our position adjacent to the river was protected by rugged, steep bluffs, cut by deep, irregular ravines. From the crest of these bluffs, the ground gently sloped away from the river. To the north, a short ridge sloped gently to the front and rear, occupied by 5 troops during the first day. Directly behind the ridge stood a small hill, with our hospital established in the ravine to the south, where horses and pack-mules were secured. Across this ravine, Moylan's troop was posted, utilizing packs and dead animals as breastworks. Benteen's troop occupied the high hill to the south. Everyone lay down, spreading themselves as thin as possible. After a few minutes, I rose and walked along the line, cautioning men not to waste ammunition, ordering skilled marksmen to fire and others to supply them with loaded guns. Firing continued until nearly dark, between 9 and 10 o'clock. Although after dusk, little attention was paid to the firing, as everyone moved freely. Naturally, all wondered about Custer, why he didn't communicate by courier or signal. The prevailing opinion was that he had been defeated, driven down the river, where he would likely join General Terry and return to our relief. Frequently, the question, "What's the matter with Custer?" elicited an impatient response. Indians are known for their frugality with fuel, but they didn't stint themselves that night. The long twilight was prolonged by numerous bonfires throughout their village, casting a supernatural aspect over the surroundings, perhaps accounting for the illusions of those who thought they saw columns of troops, etc. Although our foes didn't disturb us with intrusive attention during the night, it shouldn't be inferred that we passed the night in perfect rest, or that they concealed their proximity. They were decidedly more jubilant than we, and they made no effort to conceal their elation. Their camp was a veritable pandemonium, resounding with unbridled revelry throughout the night. They continued their frenzied celebrations, beating tom-toms, dancing, whooping, and yelling with demoniacal screams, while discharging firearms. We knew they were holding a scalp dance. In this regard, the question has often been posed: did they not have prisoners to subject to torture? The Indians deny taking any prisoners. We discovered no evidence of torture in their camps, although we did find human heads severed from their bodies. These had likely been paraded during their orgies that terrible night. Our casualties had been relatively few since taking position on the hill. The notion of relocating was discussed, but the conditions and proposition led to its indignant rejection. Some scouts were sent out soon after dark to search for signs of Custer's command, but returned shortly, reporting that the area was swarming with Sioux. Lieutenant Varnum volunteered to venture out, but was either dissuaded or forbidden from doing so. After dark, the troops were rearranged slightly. Horses were unsaddled, and mules were relieved of their packs. All animals were secured to lariats stretched and picketed to the ground. Following the cessation of firing, utter confusion reigned. Men imagined seeing columns of troops on the hills or ridges, hearing the tramp of horses, officers' commands, or even trumpet calls. Stable call was sounded by one of our trumpeters. Shots were fired by some of our men, and familiar trumpet calls were sounded by our trumpeter to alert the supposed marching column that we were friends. Every favorable expression or opinion was received with credulity and subsequently ratified with a cheer. Someone suggested that General Crook might be approaching, prompting a civilian packer, I believe, to mount a horse and gallop along the line, yelling, "Don't be discouraged, boys, Crook is coming." However, they gradually realized that the much-wished-for reinforcements were mere phantasms of their imaginations, and settled down to their task of digging rifle pits. They worked in pairs, in threes and fours. The ground was hard and dry, with only 3 or 4 spades and shovels available to the entire command. Consequently, axes, hatchets, knives, table forks, tin cups, and halves of canteens were pressed into service. Nevertheless, everyone worked diligently, and some continued digging until the enemy opened fire at early dawn, between 2:30 and 3 o'clock, ensuring that all had some form of shelter, except Benteen's men. The enemy's initial salutations were rather feeble, eliciting scant response from our side. However, as dawn gave way to daylight, their lines were heavily reinforced, and both sides maintained a continuous fusillade. Naturally, their strategy was to draw our fire and exhaust our ammunition. As they exposed themselves minimally, we forbade our men, except well-known marksmen, from firing without orders. The Indians amused themselves by standing erect, in full view for an instant, then dropping down before a bullet could reach them. However, they soon seemed to tire of this or found it too perilous. They then resorted to the old ruse of raising a hat, blouse, or blanket on a stick to draw our fire, a tactic we soon understood. Occasionally, they fired volleys on command. Their fire, however, was not particularly effective. Benteen's troops suffered greater losses than any other, as their rear was exposed to long-range firing from the hills to the north. The horses and mules suffered greatly, being fully exposed to the long-range fire from the east. Benteen approached Reno, requesting reinforcements for his line. Before departing, he instructed Gibson not to fall back under any circumstances, as this position was crucial. Gibson's men had nearly exhausted their ammunition, with some reduced to merely 4 or 5 cartridges. He was also burdened with a considerable number of wounded men. Indeed, the situation was most critical, for if the Indians had launched a charge, a retreat would have been inevitable. Private McDermott volunteered to convey a message from Gibson to Benteen, urging him to expedite the reinforcements. After considerable urging by Benteen, Reno finally directed French to lead M Troop to the south side. En route, Benteen gathered some men who were with the horses. Just prior to his arrival, an Indian had shot one of Gibson's men, touched the body with his coup stick, and began to retreat, but was killed. He was so exposed to fire that the other Indians could not retrieve his body, leaving him as the only dead Indian in our possession at Reno Hill. This boldness prompted Benteen to launch a charge, driving the Indians nearly to the river. As they retreated, they dragged several dead and wounded warriors away. The firing momentarily ceased, only to recommence with greater intensity. This, coupled with their increased activity, suggested they were contemplating a more significant action than a mere fusillade. Benteen returned to Reno, warning that if something wasn't done soon, the Indians would overrun our lines. After a brief wait, during which no action was taken, Benteen urged, "You've got to do something here on the north side and quickly. This won't do. You must drive them back." Reno then ordered us to prepare for a charge and instructed Benteen to give the signal. Benteen cried out, "All ready now, men. Now's the time. Give them hell. Hip, hip, here we go." And with a hurrah, every man from troops B, D, G, and K, except one, who remained in his pit crying like a child, advanced. The Indians fired more rapidly than before from their entire line. Our men left the pits with loaded carbines and began firing without orders soon after we started. A large body of Indians had assembled at the foot of a hill on the north, likely intending to charge, as Benteen had surmised, but they broke as soon as our line advanced. When we had progressed 70 to 100 yards, Reno called out, "Get back, men, back," and the entire line retreated. A singular fact of this sortie was that not a single man who had advanced with the lines was hit. However, immediately after everyone had returned to the pits, the one man who had not participated was shot in the head and killed instantly. The poor fellow had expressed a premonition that he would be killed, which he had shared with a comrade. Up to this point, the command had been devoid of water, and the excitement and heat had rendered our thirst almost unbearable. The men were prohibited from using tobacco, and in an effort to stimulate saliva production, they resorted to placing pebbles in their mouths. Some attempted to eat grass roots, but found no relief, while others tried to consume hard bread, only to expel it from their mouths like flour after chewing. A few potatoes were distributed, providing some respite. Around 11 a.m., the firing subsided, and volunteer parties were formed to procure water under the protection of Benteen's lines. These parties navigated the ravines, approaching within a few yards of the river. The men would prepare, make a dash for the river, fill camp kettles, and return to fill canteens. However, Indians stationed in a nearby copse of woods opened fire whenever a man exposed himself, rendering this task particularly perilous. Several men were wounded, and the additional danger of rescuing their comrades was incurred. I believe all these individuals were subsequently awarded medals of honor. By approximately 1 o'clock, the Indians had largely withdrawn, but continued to guard the river. Nevertheless, by that time, we had secured sufficient water for immediate use. Around 2 o'clock, the Indians returned, opened fire, and drove us back to the trenches, but by 3 o'clock, the firing had ceased entirely. In the waning hours of the afternoon, our gaze fell upon a handful of horsemen situated in the valley below, their purpose seemingly to observe our movements. Shortly thereafter, the grass in the valley was set aflame. At approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, a vast and formidable body emerged from behind the veil of smoke, traversing the plateau in the direction of the Bighorn Mountains. Though distant by 5 or 6 miles, the spectacle appeared considerably closer, its visage shrouded by the smoke-laden atmosphere and the dying embers of the setting sun. The travois, laden with the families and accoutrements of the enemy, formed a dense throng, whilst the warriors, arrayed in a broad column, stood vigilant sentinel. Silhouetted against the crimson-hued western horizon, their departure filled our hearts with joy. A fervent expression of gratitude to Providence for their withdrawal was soon supplanted by misgivings regarding their motivations. Had Custer, perchance, joined forces with Terry, and were they now approaching to effect our rescue? Or were they merely bereft of ammunition, seeking to relocate their village to a safe remove before launching a final, desperate assault? Mayhap 'twas naught but a ruse to lure us forth, only to strike with renewed ferocity. The stench arising from the lifeless bodies of men and horses had grown overpowering, and thus a decision was made to establish a new position in closer proximity to the river. The companies were assigned their respective stations, and the men set to work excavating pits in anticipation of a renewed attack. Our losses on the hill had amounted to 18 fallen and 52 wounded. During the nocturnal hours of June 26th, Lieutenant DeRudio, Private O'Neill, Mr. Gerard, the interpreter, and Jackson, a half-breed scout, presented themselves at our lines. These individuals had been left behind in the valley upon Reno's retreat and, in attempting to rejoin our ranks on the evening of the 25th, discovered the approaches beset by Indians. Consequently, they concealed themselves in the underbrush at a considerable distance up the valley. On the morning of Tuesday, June 27th, we arose to the sound of reveille, sans the customary morning guns. We partook in the pleasure of a hearty repast and ensured our equine companions received proper attention. Our commanding officer harbored suspicions that the Indians had devised some manner of trap for us, and thus directed our men to remain in a state of readiness to occupy the pits at a moment's notice. No definitive course of action seemed determined, save for our resolve to maintain our present position. Not an Indian was to be seen, though a few ponies grazed peacefully in the valley below. At 9:30 in the morning, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, several miles downriver. The assembly sounded, our horses were situated in a secure location, and camp kettles and canteens were filled with water. An hour of suspense ensued. However, the slow advance of the approaching force led us to conclude that they were, in fact, our own troops. But whose command is this? We wondered. We searched in vain for the familiar gray horse troop, a telltale sign of Custer's presence. It could not be Custer. Therefore, it must be Crook, for if it were Terry, Custer would undoubtedly be by his side. Cheers erupted in celebration of Crook's arrival. A white scout, Muggins Taylor, appeared with a note from General Terry, addressed to General Custer, dated June 26. The note stated that 2 of our Crow scouts had reported our column defeated, with nearly all men slain. Terry expressed skepticism regarding this tale, yet was en route with medical assistance. The scout revealed that he had been unable to reach our lines the previous evening, owing to the Indians' heightened vigilance. Shortly thereafter, Lieutenant Bradley, 7th Infantry, entered our lines, inquiring after my whereabouts. I greeted my old acquaintance warmly and posed the question, "Where is Custer?" He replied, "I know not, but I fear he is fallen," as we counted 197 lifeless bodies. I dare say, none escaped. We were utterly dumbfounded. This was the first intimation we had received regarding Custer's fate. The news seemed impossible to comprehend. It defied belief. I then escorted him to Major Reno, whereupon I introduced him to the assembled officers. General Terry and his staff, accompanied by officers from General Gibbon's column, soon approached, and their arrival was met with prolonged, hearty cheers. However, the general's grave countenance swiftly subdued the men to silence. The officers assembled to greet their guests, and the atmosphere was heavy with emotion. Scarcely a dry eye remained, and words were few, but quivering lips and firm handshakes bespoke the depth of gratitude for their timely relief and sorrow for the fallen. The remainder of the day was devoted to collecting our belongings and destroying surplus property. The wounded received attention and were conveyed to the camp of our newfound allies from the Montana column. Among the wounded was Saddler Mike Madden of my troop, whom I had promoted to sergeant on the field for his gallantry. Madden was particularly fond of his grog, and his prolonged abstinence had wrought a formidable thirst. Amputation of his leg was necessitated, a procedure performed without the benefit of anesthetic. However, the surgeon subsequently administered a generous measure of brandy. Madden eagerly imbibed the spirits, and his eyes sparkled with delight as he smacked his lips and exclaimed, "Benna, doctor, cut off my other leg." The query has often been posed: did any soldier escape the fray? In August, we encamped at the mouth of the Rosebud, whereupon we chanced upon the carcass of a horse, felled by a bullet to the head. Nearby lay a carbine, and upon the saddle rested a small grain sack fashioned from canvas, a distinctive accoutrement of the 7th Cavalry, employed solely for transporting oats during detached marches. At the time of this discovery, we surmised that perhaps a soldier had escaped, and upon reaching the river, had slain his horse for sustenance, utilizing the saddle straps to construct a makeshift raft. An Indian would scarce have abandoned the carbine, but the man may have relinquished it, either due to a dearth of ammunition or the need to jettison excess weight from his raft. The query has oft been posed: what factors contributed to Custer's defeat? To which I respond: firstly, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy and their unforeseen unity of purpose. Secondly, Reno's precipitous and panicked retreat from the valley. Thirdly, the flawed extraction of spent cartridge shells from the carbines. Regarding the first, we possessed no conclusive intelligence upon which to base our calculations of the enemy's numbers, and to this day it seems almost inconceivable that such a vast assemblage of Indians could have departed the agencies, combining their forces against our troops, without pertinent information being communicated to the commanders in the field beyond that which has been previously mentioned. The second has been touched upon incidentally. The Indians aver that, had Reno maintained his position in the valley, they would have been compelled to divide their forces, thereby inducing confusion and trepidation, and preventing the concentration of their entire warrior contingent upon Custer's battalion. That, at the moment of Custer's advance, the chiefs ordained the village to decamp, but upon Reno's retreat, this order was countermanded, and the squaws were forced to return with the pony herds. That this countermand would not have occurred had Reno's forces remained engaged in the valley. Custer's attack commenced subsequent to Reno's attainment of the bluffs. Regarding the third, we can only surmise based on our own experiences. When cartridges were sullied and corroded, the ejectors frequently failed to extract the empty shells from the chambers, necessitating the use of knives to dislodge them. When the shells were clean, no significant difficulties were encountered. To what extent this contributed to the calamity, we cannot ascertain. A possible fourth factor was the division of the command. Had the entire regiment been under Custer's direct supervision, the outcome might have differed. Conversely, the entire command might have been annihilated. The division of the command, per se, was not faulty. Similar tactics had been employed at the Battle of Washita, with success. That engagement was a surprise attack, and the separate commands cooperated fully, each commander executing their instructions with precision. My studies of the Battle of the Little Bighorn leave me in little doubt that, Had Reno executed his charge as ordered, or presented a bold front, the hostiles would have been so engrossed in the valley that Custer's approach from the northeast would have occasioned a surprise of such magnitude as to precipitate a stampede of the village, shattering the warriors' morale. On the other hand, had the entire command been concentrated under Custer's leadership, I firmly believe the charge would have been successfully executed. General Custer has been accused of harboring selfish motives in declining the additional forces purportedly offered to him whilst at the mouth of the Rosebud. The analysis of motives is a delicate matter indeed. Upon perusing letters and diaries penned during the campaign, I chanced upon references that may shed light on this matter. General Terry, in his official report, makes no mention of the alleged offer, but rather states, "It was deemed impracticable to unite Colonel Gibbon's troops with Lieutenant Colonel Custer's force, for more than half of Colonel Gibbon's troops consisted of infantry who would have been unable to keep pace with the cavalry in a rapid movement, whilst attaching Gibbon's mounted men and adding them to the 7th Cavalry would have left his force too diminutive to operate as an independent entity." Thus, it is evident that General Terry had his own reasons for not dispatching the reinforcements. In a letter dated June 10, 1876, I discovered the following: "The officers of the 2nd Cavalry are greatly disgruntled. One company must remain mounted at all times. The commanding officer selects camps most unsuitable for cavalry, and their horses are in a deplorable state. The Gatling guns were hauled by 4 condemned cavalry horses, unfit for prolonged rapid marches, and would have been unable to keep pace had such demands been made upon them. The poor condition of the horses in the 2nd Cavalry and the Gatling gun battery may have influenced the decision against their inclusion." Colonel Gibbon, in his report, remarks, "The first intimation we had of the force and strategy opposed to us was the check given to Custer's column. Major Brisbane, 2nd Cavalry, in a letter to me dated January 1892, avers that he was present at the conference on the steamboat Far West, that, at General Terry's request, he traced the routings of the troops on the map and placed pins to indicate their probable positions en route, that Custer deviated to the right and left the Rosebud a mere 20 miles shy of his furthest point on the Rosebud routing." General Terry, in his official report, states that during the conference, he communicated his plan of operations, which was as follows. Colonel Gibbon's column was to cross the Yellowstone near the mouth of the Bighorn, and thence proceed up that stream, with the expectation of arriving at the mouth of the Little Bighorn by the 26th. Lieutenant Colonel Custer, with the entire 7th Cavalry, was to advance up the Rosebud until he ascertained the direction of the trail discovered by Major Reno. If it led to the Little Bighorn, he was not to follow it, but rather keep to the south, turning toward the river only after a more circuitous march, thereby intercepting the Indians should they attempt to circumvent his left flank, and affording Gibbon's column sufficient time to converge. This plan was predicated on the assumption that the 2 columns might be brought within cooperating distance of each other, enabling either column to engage the enemy and, by a waiting fight, afford the other column sufficient time to arrive. The duration of the marches has been a subject of commentary, with some asserting that the command was subjected to excessively long and exhausting marches. The marches were as follows: June 22nd, 12 miles, June 23rd, 33 to 35 miles, June 24th, 28 miles. Then, on June 24th, at 11:30 p.m., approximately 8 miles. Thence, from the divide between the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn to the battlefield, approximately 20 miles. In total, approximately 113 miles. A battle was unavoidable, as every man in Terry's and Custer's commands anticipated a confrontation. Indeed, the purpose of the expedition was to punish the Indians, and Custer made his preparations with this determination in mind. Had Custer continued his march southward, leaving the Indian Trail, the Indians would have been apprised of our movement by the 25th, and a battle would have ensued in close proximity to the same field where Crook had been attacked and repelled merely a week prior. The Indians would never have remained encamped, allowing the several columns to converge and attack them. Had they escaped unpunished, Custer would undoubtedly have faced censure. The 29th and 30th of June were devoted to destroying property left in the Indian village, preparing litters to transport the wounded, and conveying them under cover of night to the Bighorn, where they were embarked upon the Far West. Captain Grant Marsh, master of the Far West, was the pioneering navigator of the Bighorn River, and with unwavering courage, He had held his vessel in position despite receding waters, risking the stranding of his boat on the treacherous river's rocks and shoals. Captain Marsh was ever prepared to take any risks demanded by the services of his government, for he was a man of unyielding energy and resources, resolute in his determination to overcome all obstacles. On July 1st and 2nd, the command marched to and crossed the Yellowstone, encamping on Pease Bottom, the site of our 1873 engagement with the hostiles. At noon on July 3rd, the Far West, laden with the wounded, Captain Baker's company serving as escort, and Captain Smith, General Terry's aide-de-camp and assistant adjutant general of the expedition, bearing dispatches, etc., cast off, and with full steam ahead, crashed through willows and careened against mud banks, embarking on its remarkable voyage down the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. The vessel reached Bismarck at 11:30 p.m. on July 5th, bringing the astonishing news of Custer's last battle to the 39 widows at Fort Lincoln and to the world. Recent publications commenting on the troops' movements and the conduct and characteristics of officers prompt me to augment the foregoing account. Disobedience of orders. A meticulous examination of the orders issued to General Custer reveals that he was afforded a virtually free hand. If any supplementary instructions were given, they were never divulged to the public. General Terry lacked practical experience in Indian warfare, whereas General Custer possessed such experience, having studied Indian characteristics and observed them intimately in both peace and war. He knew that, throughout our centuries-long history of Indian warfare, escapes had outnumbered punishments for outrages and depredations, primarily due to the failure to pursue the hostiles vigorously. That the key to finding the hostiles lay in following the trail and maintaining pursuit. That success often depended on surprise attacks, typically executed via night approaches and daybreak assaults. That forewarned approaches usually resulted in the scatteration of the enemy into groups or families, facilitating their escape and disorganizing pursuit. It was a patent absurdity to suppose that two commands, numbering 700 and 400, separated by a distance of 50 to 100 miles, could coordinate their movements in that expansive terrain and effect a cooperative attack on the hostiles. In such an event, had the hostiles escaped, who would have borne the blame? As I have previously stated, the region toward Tulloch's Fork was under surveillance, and it is reasonable to assume that, but for circumstances necessitating a change in plans, Scout Hare and Dean would have been dispatched to General Terry's headquarters with pertinent information regarding our plans, etc. It is implausible to suggest, as some have contended, that the two commands under Custer and Gibbon were to converge at or near the mouth of the Little Bighorn on June 26. The estimated number of hostiles, ranging from 1,000 to 1,500, did not inspire undue trepidation within our command. We were cognizant, of course, that considerable casualties would ensue, a misfortune to be borne by individuals, but a disaster of such magnitude as ultimately occurred was not deemed probable. General Custer had no reason to anticipate a general exodus of Indians from the Missouri River agencies and those in Nebraska to join the hostile camps without timely warning being furnished by the agents, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the Interior Department to the military authorities. Such a warning, dispatched by General Sheridan via Fort Lincoln by courier, was received approximately a week subsequent to the battle, too late to avert the calamity. I have had the misfortune of perusing articles that maliciously impute wholesale drunkenness to both officers and enlisted men, including the utterly abstemious General Custer. I do not believe that any officer, with the exception of Major Reno, possessed liquor in the field. Major Reno had a half-gallon keg that he brought with him, but I doubt that any other officer partook of its contents. I had the opportunity to observe all the officers early in the morning and again at our halt at the Divide, as well as when officers' call was sounded to announce the decision to attack, and I discerned no signs of intoxication. All wore a serious, thoughtful countenance, betokening their awareness of the weighty responsibilities before them. Among the queries posed has been this: if Reno had advanced to the sound of the guns, upon hearing the firing on Custer's field, would he have rescued Custer's command? Frankly, I do not believe that Custer's command would have been rescued under Reno's leadership. At no point during the battle did his conduct inspire confidence. His faltering advances down the valley, his halting, his falling back to a defensive position in the woods of the old riverbed before his command had suffered a single casualty in the ranks, his disorganized, panic-stricken retreat to the bluffs with scant resistance, his conduct during the siege, and until the arrival of General Terry, was not such as to inspire confidence or even respect, except for his authority. And there was a moment during the night of the 25th when his authority, under certain conditions, was to be disregarded. We deemed it advisable that he should depart. His attention was drawn to the firing on the Custer field. It was suggested that he proceed. He tarried, awaiting the ammunition packs to replenish our ammunition. Then he waited for the delayed pack train. We commenced our march, proceeding as far as the first ridge, whereupon we beheld the dismounted men crossing the valley, men who had been left behind during his retreat. We halted, awaiting their arrival, to be mounted and have their ammunition replenished. Then we advanced to the high point, whence we could overlook the Custer battlefield. We observed the commotion on that field as the hostiles began to move in our direction. 3 troops, D, K, and M, were then ordered to take positions and hold their ground. With the remaining 4 troops and the pack train, Reno returned to our initial position on the bluffs, nearly 2 miles distant. He then ordered the troops in position to fall back immediately. I hope this first-hand account gives you a new perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos like this. I hope to bring you more first-hand accounts of different battles, so have a great day, and I'll see you next time.